So welcome everyone to our November meeting. Bill Welsh is joining us today. He is the Executive Director in the Office of Disability Services at Rutgers. So I'm really pleased that Bill could make time to visit with us today. He is a nationally recognized expert in disability services in higher education, and he has a long history of work in the field, a lot of experience, and also worked through the NFB complaint at Penn State, which was, I'm sure, a huge learning experience for you, Bill. So we're looking forward to hearing your comments today. If all of you have questions or comments that you want to make during the presentation, feel free to either raise your hand if you want to use the talk button, or type your questions in the chat, and Bill and I will keep an eye on that. So welcome, Bill. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. And good morning, Montana. It's afternoon here in New Jersey. So I'm really excited to be here. And to begin, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I started my career in disability services in 1994. And worked at a community college for a year before moving to Drexel University. And then a large part of my career was spent at Penn State University for 14 years. And I worked as the director of the Office for Disability Services there. And if any of you know anything about Penn State, it's a state-related institution, but we have 24 campuses. And it's a large system that I worked across the state. And it was really an exciting time. We made a lot of really great changes, which I'm going to show and share with you today. And then, you know, as time went on, we made some vital changes to not only the physical accessibility of all the campuses, which occurred over time, and that was mainly very deliberate and planned. And while they were doing a lot of things in planning for accessibility, for physical accessibility, there was a lot of things that needed to be done in regards to accessible technology and information. So, and it wasn't that Penn State wasn't doing anything. We actually had several groups working on web accessibility for many years. A lot of it was grassroots types of things, and we even had a policy as early as 2002. But I think people became complacent, and technology really moved so quickly that accessibility fell off the radar screen. So in 2010, of course, most people know that the National Federation for the Blind filed a complaint against Penn State. While that was a difficult time, it was actually probably one of the best things that could have happened there. And due to the complaint, the Penn State community had to come together to create accessible, usable environments for technology and information, and that included websites, online courses, classroom technology, technological systems, even the ATMs that were on campus that were run through another bank, a third-party bank. So looking back, I can honestly say that it was one of the most difficult times in my career in 20 years. But also one of the most rewarding ones, and one that I probably learned the most in a very short period of time. So currently I'm the Executive Director of the Office for Disability Services at Rutgers. We have about 62,000 students here at Rutgers on 3 campuses, geographically different. Here at New Brunswick is our largest campus, and even in New Brunswick, geographically, we're sit on 20 miles and 5 campuses across the river. And then we have a smaller campus at Camden, New Jersey, another campus at our Newark campus, which is more of a center city type of campus. And then last year we merged with the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey to become our new school and campus of Rutgers Biobehavioral Health System. So we actually doubled our faculty and staff last year. So a lot of the things I'm going to tell you are pretty amazing here at Rutgers because we've done a lot in a short period of time, but we are also very far behind, and we're playing a lot of catch up. So today, let me just tell you about what we're going to talk about. I'm going to first share with you some thoughts about ways that I found to change not only the questions that are asked about accessibility, but change the culture of a college university, and to talk less about accessibility and more about usability for everyone. Next, I'm going to provide an overview of my Penn State experience and how a little of the resources and many partnerships changed the culture of accessible technology and information. And what we created basically was a model, I think, for all of us to utilize across the country. Third, I'm going to talk with you about my experiences starting all over again at Rutgers. And the university is being very proactive, embracing the concepts of accessible technology and information. Online courses, we're working towards procurement policies and procedures. And there's been a lot of collaborations of very different groups across the campuses to make this happen. And then I will share with you some strategies learned from both experiences. I think there are some tried and true methods of moving your institution's culture away from just making changes for disabilities, for people with disabilities, but also obtaining buy-in from all to make true cultural change and a shift to usable accessibility for everyone. And then lastly, I'll share with you some final thoughts about the future, how I think we can crowdsource some of these efforts and stop reinventing the wheel over and over again at each institution. So I like to use this slide in most of my presentations because I think the cartoon really depicts what we're talking about, where a lot of us are, and why we need to change the ability to change how we're thinking about this. So let me audio describe the cartoon for everyone. So this is a picture of a group of kids outside of a school with a person shoveling snow from the steps. Next to the steps is a ramp with snow piled high, and they're all waiting to enter the school. There's a group of kids and one who's using a wheelchair. The student in the wheelchair says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the person shoveling says, "All these kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, I'll clear the ramp for you." The kid in the wheelchair says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And then the caption below the cartoon says, "Clearing a path for people with special needs also clears a path for everyone." And I use this graphic because the message is really simple. It's a lesson that most institutions have learned over time about physical accessibility, but the same message could be very much used when we talk about accessible and usable technology and information. Too many times institutions just buy technology, upload inaccessible content to websites and courses. However, my message throughout today's talk is that we need to start designing proactively for everyone, disabled, differently abled, or not, and then we will meet everyone's needs all at the same time, similar to the graphic cartoon here. So many institutions today are still clearing the stairs first, and then when requested, they clear or build the ramps for access. So let's start to begin to change the message from accessibility for a few to usability for everyone. So just a couple comments that I have in regards to this whole change of message, change of culture. So when I started in disability services in 1994, the Americans with Disabilities Act was just being passed, and a lot of institutions were even struggling to figure out how to comply with the new law. The field's changed a great deal over the past 20 years, and these changes have not only assisted people with disabilities, but they've also impacted everyone. So today there isn't a building being built or a sidewalk installed without having national and state accessibility guidelines being met. And I think even more importantly, it's created a much more usable environment for everybody. So not only do curb cuts assist individuals who utilize wheelchairs or scooters, they also are usable by people who use bikes, skateboards, baby strollers. And so we've made great strides in the physical environment. Believe it or not, everyone in this room is probably impacted by these changes. And by changing the physical environment for people with disabilities, we have also created much more usable environments for everybody. So it's my belief that institutions of higher education in general are in a similar situation with technology and information that we were in the early 1990s when the ADA mandated changes to the physical environment. And while we've made great strides in creating more accessible physical environments, we're way behind in developing, designing accessible and usable technology, websites, online courses, etc. So technologies progress so quickly that accessibility and usability is typically an afterthought. So most institutions are still in the reactionary mode of operating rather than evaluating products for accessibility and usability prior to purchase. So the problem with this model is that not only is it inefficient, but several colleges have found themselves in complaints, litigation, because these considerations were not taken into account. So today I'm going to focus on the concept of promoting usability, universal design for everyone instead of accessibility for a few. And I believe that the disability field has kind of focused too much on using the law to try to create change in higher education for individuals with disabilities. And while I'm not discounting that, the law is very powerful, and the laws have provided a lot of access for people. However, putting too much emphasis on the law and little emphasis on how to make environments usable for everyone, we've kind of created a system where people are afraid to say or do the wrong thing or fear of being sued. And I found that through better understanding of how changes for individuals with disabilities also provide enhanced access for everyone, that's when kind of true cultural change at an institution might take place. So some of this has to do with continued attitudes towards people with disabilities. However, I find that when attitudinal changes are mostly about lack of knowledge. So to me, knowledge is extremely powerful. When I face attitudinal changes in my role, and it happens still almost every day or at least a couple times a week, I see them more as teachable moments, and I don't really get angry about it. I think it's a way that I can bring people into understanding maybe what some of their biases might be, some of the things that they talk about, and frankly some of the biggest people that have been the biggest barriers in the past are also now my biggest allies in regards to disability and usability, et cetera. So I don't see it as a barrier. I think it's just about people not really knowing and not knowing, having the knowledge that they need to move forward. So hopefully by the end of the presentation today, I'll provide you with enough information, tools, resources, and general knowledge that you can also begin to make some subtle changes in your community and your institutions. And after talking with Marlene about what you've all done in Montana, you all seem to be very much well on the way. So I can probably learn a lot from you, and we can learn from each other. So my vision for the future, when people ask me, you know, what do you think we should do, Bill? And I think that my hope is, and I tell my bosses this jokingly, I said, you know, one day hopefully, you know, you're not needing me, or at least as many of us in our offices, because the hope is that anybody who's qualified can enroll in any institution of higher education across the country, have equal access to their classrooms, whether that be physically or online or in whatever environment we're using in the future. And rather than being reactive when someone with different needs requires a change, we actually have environments that are designed universally for everybody, so that fewer accommodations are necessary. Everyone benefits. Technology that's used is accessible and usable by everybody. Course materials and textbooks are actually usable and accessible for everybody. And everyone basically benefits from those changes. And so hopefully in the future, like curb cuts and automatic door operators that we have in the physical environment, we'll actually get there someday with instructional technology and within the classroom environment. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay. So I'm going to move on to some disability statements that I have found have made a huge impact. I find that when you're talking to administrators, you're talking to IT folks, faculty, employees, students, etc., everybody has their own way of getting this information, something that's going to actually click with them. It could be that they have a family member with a disability. They may know somebody with a disability. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes it's enrollment driven. So I think trying to find what might work for your audience and what might work for your administrators, et cetera, is really different for everybody. So sometimes I like to start with just some statistics. So some of the most compelling statistics for me are that people with disabilities represent about 19% of the population, or nearly 1 in 5 people. And then within higher education, the latest statistics show that 11% of all post-secondary students have a disability of some sort. That doesn't mean that they've all disclosed, but that they actually are in the classroom already. But the latest statistics are 11%. However, people with disabilities tend to complete college at a lower rate than non-disabled. And the statistic, unfortunately, is a reality for many reasons across the country. And I'm not necessarily going to focus on the whys, but some of this can easily be prevented by providing an environment that is welcoming, more proactive rather than reactive. I find that some students stop out simply because it's too difficult for them. So every time they enter a class, every time they go onto an online course, regardless of their disability, they have to ensure that the course meets their needs. So institutions are really losing students with disabilities at alarming rates, which impacts our retention rates, graduation rates, and frankly, all of our economies. But I also would say that it's not just people with disabilities. So some of the same issues that some of our students that have disabilities are finding within inaccessible or unusable environments also affect people that are using mobile technology and tablets and having their iPads read their course materials, or et cetera, et cetera. And so, the impact is greater than just losing 11% of your student population. You could be losing more if you don't address the accessibility issue. So I find that people with disabilities represent the nation's largest minority group, the only group that any one of us can become a member of at any time. And if this isn't a reason to change your institution, I'm not sure really what is. So anyone entering a course could be a person with different issues for access at any moment. Any student in that class could need the types of access we're talking about today. So this could be said for the faculty and employees that support the courses as well. So really, when we design accessible courses, materials, instructional technologies, and technologies in general, we're really helping everybody so that if something does happen to an individual in the course, we're ready, we're set, and we don't have to be as reactive. The last thing is that we're actually not really retaining the single largest minority group in our institutions. And that translates into the single largest minority group that's seeking employment in today's marketplace. So if they don't have a degree, statistics show that their marketability is much less. There's also some changes in laws. And basically, there's a new law of the Rehab Act, Section 503, that is requiring employers that receive federal financial assistance or federal contracts to employ 7% of their employees, which should be individuals with disabilities. I'm finding and working with employers that they're having difficulty finding students qualified with disabilities to meet their quotas. Also, people are afraid to come forward because of some of the stigmas, but I think if we do a better job in preparing our students, they don't have as much difficulty within our higher education institutions. They're also going to try be better to promote their work environment and get a job in the future. And I think that's what we're all looking for. So that's just some information about some statements that I think make an impact for administrators, faculty, and others. So I'm going to move on to a concept that constantly I hear in disability services, and I hear it less than I did probably when I started in this field 20 years ago, but I still hear it, frankly, a lot in the IT departments. Faculty say this all the time. I get calls from faculty, saying to me, "Well, Bill, I think I have one of yours." And I make the comment, "Well, what do you mean? I have 3 kids. You have one of my kids?" And they say, no, I mean one of your students, one of your people. And I said, okay, well, I believe since you're teaching the class, that's also one of your people and one of your students. And so I think we do a lot of finger pointing at various groups back and forth. And what I've seen happen as we begin to provide better knowledge, better information to our faculty and to our university communities, there's a lot less of the finger pointing, and basically everybody has a shared responsibility. So I'm starting to see that here at Rutgers, and that's a big culture change for folks that, there's a lot of champions here that really get it. And I found that at Penn State as we started to provide better trainings, more information to faculty and to staff, that everybody kind of got it. They didn't have that finger pointing anymore, and they ran away from the question of, well, why do we have to do this? And now I'm finding even here at Rutgers that people are asking more, how do we do this? Which is why we're actually here today. So I think moving away from this who's responsible question is really important for institutions to move forward. So the next slide talks about changing the reason. So as I talked earlier, I find people get this message and get the how do I move forward in different ways. So sometimes the lawsuit and compliance works for a little bit with administrators. They understand that others have been sued, but then I think they move to the fact that, oh, well, that won't happen here. So I don't think that message is really a sustainable one, because they're going to move on to the next shiny object, and there's another law over here or over there that gets their attention. So I think we need to come up with other reasons instead of just the law. And as I said earlier, I think disability providers and our champions within our organizations, we need to change the reasons why accessible technology and information is important in higher education. So I found several that work depending on who the audience is. So let's look at, for academics and possibly administrators, and regarding accreditation, for instance. I've started to be asked by several departments when they're going through accreditation. They've interviewed me, and they want to know, what is the university's policies, procedures for web accessibility, course accessibility, what are the institutional plans? And I've had a number of groups that I've worked with across the country that are telling me that more and more accrediting bodies are asking these kinds of questions. So if we don't have a plan and the university doesn't have policies and processes and procedures in place, they might get dinged on accreditation. The next thing that I think makes a big impact is bad press, and bad press dictates into lost revenue for institutions. It also doesn't create a very welcoming environment for people when they hear about lawsuits. Good press about making courses and programs usable by everyone is a much better way to go. So keep in mind also that people who don't have disabilities are also using assistive technologies and are now more in the mainstream than ever. So I think changing the argument, changing the talk, rather than talking about accessibility for a few, and talking more about everybody uses technology today. People get into their cars every day and they use their voice to, talk, or their wireless phones to connect. Sometimes they talk on their phones in the car, unfortunately. Wirelessly, they can even dictate things within their car or within their daily lives. A lot of people use voice texting. So making technology, making courses more accessible also allows it to be more usable by most. And then the last thing, I think it's just the right thing to do, so convincing people that however they might get this, that this is the way to go. So here at Rutgers, what we're doing in regards to getting faculty on board, a lot of faculty we found were not coming to some of the workshops we were doing on accessibility. So we're actually changing the titles of those and saying more things like, why don't you come to this workshop and find out how to make courses more usable by all of your students. And so it kind of changes the message a little bit. They come and then they learn about accessibility as well as usability at the same time. So, finding ways to change the message a bit. It's the same message, but how we say it is actually, can be very different and get people on board. So let's talk about that a little bit, about the differences between accessibility and usability. So accessibility is about ensuring an equivalent experience for people with disabilities and leveling the playing field. And usability is about designing products to be effective, efficient, and satisfying. And what I'm proposing is that we change to a more usable accessibility, which combines usability and accessibility and develops a positive user experience for everybody. So accessibility, when we talk about that, I think we delve more into the accommodation realm, which isn't as proactive. We also, when we're just talking about usability, we may not be making things as efficient and effective, but I think combining the two really helps provide a better positive experience for everybody. And that information comes from the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. So a concept I want to introduce as we move forward today is the concept of a practice group. And again, this is the idea of community building, relationship building. When the NFB complaint hit at Penn State, we all kind of got together. There was about 11 of us that were assigned to do this, and we said, how are we going to do this? We were told, you're not going to get any more resources, no more personnel. You have to look at the resources already at the university and figure this out. And so I had been working with a group in Pennsylvania on transition, and we had the concept of practice groups. And rather than calling all of our groups committees at Penn State, we actually called them practice groups. To me, a committee is kind of a life sentence or a death sentence. You're going to be on this committee and you're going to be there for life. Whereas a practice group allows people to get together to talk about a different concept, and you can kind of bring people in and out, build their expertise, gain from their experience, and then they can move on. And you're building really the group itself and working in one concept. And so the idea of practice group comes from Dr. Wenger, and it's a group of people who share an interest in a particular domain or area. It's through the process of sharing information and experiences with the group that the members learn from each other and have an opportunity to develop themselves personally and professionally. And through practice groups, knowledge and understanding is the key to the success of any organization, and this makes the cultural shift occur. So rather than having a small committee, a practice group, you can actually pull from lots of people throughout your organizations and your institutions that allow people to gain knowledge and work together that I don't find committees actually. If you've ever been on a committee, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about how things happened at Penn State and what I learned from that experience. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to let me know. So in 2010, in November, it was actually a Friday afternoon about 3:30. I was sitting at my desk and our ADA coordinator called me and said, "Bill, have you seen the news?" And I said, "No." He said, "I think you need to go to this website." So he sent me this website, and I thought he was joking. And he wasn't joking. The National Federation for the Blind filed a complaint against Penn State, and they were contending that a variety of the technologies at the university were inaccessible to individuals who are blind. And this included, it was one of the first complaints filed that really hit every piece of electronic information technology. So it included websites, Angel, which was the course management system or learning management system that Penn State was using, clickers in the classrooms, ATMs, smart podiums, library websites, library search engines, databases, and frankly it went on and on. We, at that time, got a group together to try to figure out how to resolve the complaint, and myself and Christian Vinton Johansson was, we were designated as the co-chairs for handling the complaint for the university and trying to get the group together. And so we started to form groups, and eventually in October of 2011, an agreement to resolve the complaint, which included timelines for the next 3 years. We came up with a strategic plan, and I'm going to share with you in the next slides how all that was done. So the first thing that we decided to do was to really form a group, and an accessible technology and information group. It says committee here, but it was actually a group. And the idea was that we needed to figure out how to handle this whole animal. So the charge of the group was to develop trainings and best practices for faculty, staff, students on accessible technology and information. The next thing was to develop and maintain coordinated efforts on resources, tools, and best practices. Identify additional system-wide resources that might be needed to allow for the complaint and agreement to happen. And then we developed a group of practice groups to meet strategic plan and implementation goals and objectives. Finally, and this took time, we did look at a reorganization of information technology to include accessibility across the division of IT and courses. And as I said, there was little additional funding streams or staff in the very beginning. So probably the first year and a half, we had a group of 11 of us that got together every other week. We decided to form 9 practice groups that would allow us to spread the resources across the university. The other thing that helped greatly, and if you can get this done at your institutions, it really helped. We had the provost, which at Penn State was the highest academic leader administrator in the university. We had the provost send out a letter to all the budget executives, and all the budget executives actually reported to him. And he sent it out to everybody saying, you will designate a liaison to our Accessible Technology and Information Committee that will provide, each unit will report back to this committee their efforts on accessible technology and information and websites. And the budget executives were actually made responsible for adhering to the policies and procedures for all the committees. So it really went a long way for the university and for the budget executives to understand that this is serious, and the having that letter from the provost and having this accessible technology committee report to him and report back to him really made a huge, huge impact across the university. So getting buy-in from the top, I think, is extremely, extremely important. So the agreement, as well as other recent complaints, have set the bar fairly high with regards to colleges and universities providing equally effective technologies. And so the idea here now is that no longer is providing accommodation just the norm. You have to provide equally effective technologies, and that has to, if not, that might result in a complaint. So the highlights of what we did at Penn State were to try to come to a way that we can all get together. So the ATI committee at Penn State established university-wide communities of practice. The very first one that we decided to look at is web accessibility. It was one that was large. There were 8 million websites at Penn State, and the web accessibility review and implementation team, we looked at tools across the country. There were 3 at that time that met WCAG 2.0 standards, and so we chose one called Compliance Sheriff. We rolled it out across the university. Every budget executive appointed a web liaison to this group whose charge was to go back to their unit and work within their unit to come up with a strategic plan on how they were going to do this in 3 years. So it was a 3-year plan. We focused more on just 10 things the first year, as opposed to trying to tackle the whole WCAG 2.0. And as we rolled this out, we decided we would do this in a stepped up approach. So the first year we were looking at these 10 blockers, we called them, for people who are blind. And we found if we could just focus our trainings and all of our information and reports on those 10 things, we would make a great deal of progress across the university. And that worked really well. The next year we were looking for an additional 20% of the guidelines, and then after that it was 35, 50, and then at the end they were looking at 85%. Because we realized that there was never anything that was 100%, and it always depended on the browsers people were using, the technology they were using, but if we could get the university to 85 to 90% of the way there, we were really making a huge impact across the whole institution. The second group was an accessibility training group, and what we did was, instead of creating new trainings, we looked at the trainings for Word and PowerPoint, some of the technologies that we were using within classrooms. And when we were doing trainings for those things for everybody, we were including accessibility features in the training. So people didn't have to go to specialized training. We just included those in regular trainings that were already happening. And that worked really well. So we worked with a group within IT that provided training. We also provided additional accessibility trainings across the university. And I think in the first year we had 100 trainings that had over 50 people attend. Prior to that we were doing trainings and I think 10 people were showing up at our places. So it really was extremely helpful for all of us to do that training within what was already existing within the university. So we didn't need additional resources necessarily for training. The next thing was a university-wide accessibility website. So this was the place where we housed all the information in one place for Penn State for accessible technology and information. Any event that went on with regards to accessibility and technology was posted on the website. So it was a place that we could market to the whole university. If you want to know anything about accessible technology and information, instructional materials, go to this website. And We had our policies and procedures there, our implementation plan. So everything was public. It was really a way to showcase that what the university was doing, and we decided to just put it out there on a website. We're doing a similar thing here at Rutgers with accessibility.rutgers.edu. And again, it's a way for us to, as we develop trainings, as we develop events, and announce things, we're going to have that for everybody to view. And it's open. It's an open source product. It's something that anybody can view and anybody can use. The next groups were accessible online learning, captioning, assistive and adaptive technology, and then accessible instruction materials. Accessible online learning, Penn State hired an access manager for online learning. They also hired a person that was working directly with students, because Penn State at that time had about 11,000 students that were taking courses online. And the numbers were somewhere around 150, 200 students with disabilities that were enrolled, that were receiving accommodations. So a person that was directly working with students was hired. Then they hired a team of instructional designers and a manager of the instructional designers to make sure that all the courses that were developed within the World Campus at Penn State met the accessibility guidelines. And so people were actually checking off and working with faculty to make sure that their materials, their content, and the information and learning management systems were all accessible before a course actually went out. And that group is still ongoing and making changes consistently, but it was a really very effective project, and one that, when you talk about lowering the amount of accommodations that we had to do for students, I never really had to worry about whether or not a video was captioned, because I knew it was. And if a professor put up a YouTube video or was using something that we found out, we had ways and processes, procedures for making sure that that all happened. We also looked at captioning, and captioning was being done across the university at various places, but it wasn't being done consistently. So we formed a group to look at captioning across the university and developed policies and procedures in regards to that. And I think the hardest one, and one that I think Penn State is still working on, is accessible instructional materials. And so when you're not dealing with the online environment, how do you get professors and faculty and instructors to make sure that their content is accessible? A lot of this has to do with training, going to faculty meetings and making sure that they have the information they need, because they don't know what they don't know. And I think that started to make a huge impact there as well. And currently, procurement, there's a procurement policy at Penn State where they're working with IT and purchasing in the RFP process. So anything that is looking at purchasing in a large scale, I think it's $10,000 or more, they're actually checking it for accessibility within IT. They have a person who's visually impaired and blind using JAWS, making sure that the VPAT that is out there is actually correct, and making recommendations to the purchasers to put into contracts to ensure that accessibility is addressed, and any issues of accessibility are either in the contract or it's in development. So it's a staged process. So they might buy the technology, but in a year, all these changes must be made, or the contract would be null and void. So I think those are important pieces for procurement. And the last thing was the university libraries. They had an accessibility initiative. Their timeline was to have all their websites accessible within 1 year. And they actually made that progress, and they reached that accessibility of all their websites within a year. And now they're working with vendors and ensuring that their search engines are accessible as well. So the assessments, I think, are really important as you build a model for how you're going to look at your success. So at Penn State built in a yearly progress report, so each web liaison and each budget unit had to provide the provost with a report, and the accessible technology information team gathered that information and then provided the university with the yearly report. And they reported on training sessions, attendance, what departments attended, evaluations at each event. There were reports on web accessibility from High Software, and those went to each budget executive as well as to the provost. One of the biggest things that I think made a huge impact was using social media. There's a site called Yammer, and we worked with our web liaisons using social media to ensure that we're all not receiving emails like crazy, and it was all the information, all the discussion boards were actually in the social media site, and that helped the community greatly come together and work together in the social media site. So does anybody have any questions about what I just talked about from Penn State, because I just threw a lot of information at you before I move on to Rutgers?
Bill, I have a question. The
Sure.
social media site, is that still up and running? Is that something we could all take a look at?
The Yammer site is really, from what I understand, is more for Penn State. So I don't know if they're still using it or not. But it was something in-house that information could be shared with each other. If somebody had a problem or an issue, you know, they would post it to the Yammer site. So it's kind of like Facebook for web developers.
Okay, great, thanks for that. And Kari wrote in the chat, how would someone propose a more direct accessibility policy or focus to leadership that is open to ideas, but is always saying we're just not there yet, or we're just one office?
Good question. I think a policy really has to involve everybody. You have to get buy-in not only from the top, but also get buy-in from below. And when you say we're just one office, meaning we're just one IT office, or? Correct, okay. So I think changing that message, Kari, into it's not just one office's responsibility, frankly, it's the whole university. And the big thing that happened at Penn State was we changed that message. It really was about the university and everybody kind of pooling our resources to get the job done. So I don't think it's important to look at one office. I think changing the message and getting the administration to get the buy-in from them to say this is a university responsibility. We need to change our policies. Everybody is responsible for accessible online learning. All the faculty posting content into a learning management system is responsible. Web developers, you know, as part of their workflow, and I think what we're going to look at here at Rutgers is changing the human resources job descriptions for web developers to include accessibility as part of their job. You know, and if we could do that for faculty, that would be great, but I'm not sure the contracts would allow for us to do that. But you know, changing the message that it's not just one office and we're not there yet. We're not there yet because everybody doesn't see it as their responsibility. And also, I think changing the message from accessibility for just a few people with disabilities and changing the message to this is making things usable for the mobile environment. This is making things usable for everybody. And I think once you change that culture, change that message, people start to get it a little bit more. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the idea is not, that it's just one person or one person's job. It's really a much more holistic approach. So that's actually a good segue. I know we only have about 5 minutes or so, but I wanted to tell you about something that's actually happening within the Committee on Institutional Cooperation, or the Big Ten. We're actually working across all of our campuses because we realized, especially with the Penn State thing, we felt like we were out there alone. That people were working on different things, but there wasn't a concerted effort. So there was a grassroots effort within the Big Ten that started about 8 years ago, looking at accessible technology, but we didn't have the buy-in from our chief information officers. So we approached them back in 2012, and a new group called the Information Technology Accessibility Group was formed. And the great thing about this is it's supported by the chief information officers themselves. They're putting money into development of projects, and there's 4 projects going on currently. Vendor relations and procurement, so ensuring that who has policies, who has procedures, how are we approaching vendors, not just as each institution, but how could we do this across all the Big Ten. There's a group called the Captioning Group, and we're doing surveys of how are other people handling captioning at their institutions. Do they have bulk buys? Do they have students doing captioning? How are transcriptions created? And we're finding that it's happening in lots of different ways across all of our campuses. And here at Rutgers, we have actually formed a captioning group as well to look at online learning, captioning, and captioning of media, and how is that going to happen here at Rutgers. And then sharing that information across the CIC. Another one is a media player, because there aren't that many accessible media players that screen readers can use. So that's another area. And then a larger group that's developing open source product for web accessibility is the FAE evaluator, Functional Accessibility Evaluator, out of the University of Illinois. And we're actually we formed a group of all of our institutions to help develop that as an open source way to check your websites. And probably in the next year that will be available to anybody. So rather than possibly using commercial products, you could use the FAE to check all of your websites in your whole domain rather than just checking one web page at a time. So that's a really exciting project. I was actually on a call this morning with them looking at how to continue to develop that. How do we involve the ARIA landmarks, and how do we provide a really good system for people to do reports on their web pages. And then we're looking at a group across the CIC on training, and possibly looking at electronic course materials and how can we share books that we've all scanned for students with disabilities, but across all of our systems. So any questions about the CIC? Because I think there's a lot going on there that if we could crowdsource some of the things that we're all doing and work across all of our systems. I'm working a lot with Cal State and Cheryl Pruitt and her group, but also with Geyer Dietrich and the W3C, and as well as WebAIM too, with Cheryl, with Cindy Rolland. The question is any of this information of the CIC public? The FAE, Functional Accessibility Evaluator, is public. The development of it is not yet, but it will be eventually open source. So if you go, not a lot of the information on the CIC is actually public, but if you want any further information about what our projects are, I could probably get that to you. The information on captioning is really kind of in the infancy stages. Right now we're just surveying each institution to see what they're doing, and eventually we'll make recommendations to the CIOs about how to handle that. We're in the same process here at Rutgers because we have 4 learning management systems and we have lots of different places doing online learning. You know, how are we going to handle captioning at each one of those places? And we're looking to form a group here right now to look at captioning. Okay, Marlene, we are, I think, at our time, but I wanted to see. Thanks. Good luck. Thanks. What is it that, do you want me to continue or do you want us to stop at this point?
Oh, this is really so interesting, Bill. If you'd like to continue for a few minutes about what's going on at Rutgers, I'm sure some people might want to stay and listen to that. And Bill, I hope you'll kind of keep us posted on what's happening with the CIC. I'll try and stay in touch with the presentations you're making at CSUN and other conferences, because for institutions like all of us here in Montana, we're smaller, and any of that larger work that you're doing that smaller institutions can benefit from, it would be great to know about.
Yeah, and I think eventually a lot of what we're doing will be shared. The CIOs of the Big Ten are really looking for this group to be a national leader, and you know, trying to find out how to do this well and kind of be a model for other institutions, but also share what we've learned and share our resources. So, you know, for now, it's really a working and practice group, but I think in the next year or two, we'll be able to share what we have. We're still trying to figure out how to work as a large group, and then I think we will eventually be able to share that information outside.
That would be really awesome.
Yeah.
So I can stay about 5 more minutes, Bill. As you know, I have a presentation to the law school with Aaron coming right up here, but I will stay on as long as I can, and we'll stop the recording possibly in about five minutes or so.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Take care. Okay, so basically at Rutgers, we started a plan last year, and I'll just run through this fairly quickly. Rutgers really was far behind, and as most of you know, there are grassroots things happening, but lots of silos. And so now we've pulled various university departments together to start talking about web accessibility. We decided that that was the low-hanging fruit that we could actually handle across all of our systems. So we've just finalized a draft, and that is now sitting at the Vice President's office for final signature. It is a 3-year strategic plan for implementation, and we formed an executive council here called the RU WCAG Executive Council that's made up of all the IT managers at all of our campuses. And the great thing is nobody's really balking at this. They're really just trying to wait to see how are we going to do this. How, you know, we had to find out who all of our web developers were. And so I think that's one of the first things is who's doing web development, and then we're going to tackle trainings for content providers as well. We're also including instructional designers for online learning. So we're kind of in the infancy stages of this, but we've made some great progress, and we're going to look at how yearly reports on web accessibility. For right now, we're training people on how to use the Wave toolbar in FAE, and then we may move to the FAE audit to look at all of our pages. Probably next spring, we're going to look at a baseline of all of our web pages to see where we're at and how we're going to move forward. We've just hired a position for a manager of accessible technology. We're actually in the search process right now. And that person will be in charge of this group across the university to look at web accessibility and instructional technology. We've also are hiring an instructional designer and a web technician. That position's just been posted this past week as well. So, you know, we're in the infant stages like many of you, but it is really a great progress that we've made in a short period of time here at Rutgers. So our second year plan, well, a couple other things that we're working on at the university libraries and disability services, as well as our learning centers and our IT labs. We're creating a learning technologies lab in our main library for students so that we're going to collaborate on creating alternative format text, assistive and adaptive technologies, meeting with students that just happen to come into the learning lab. They don't necessarily have to have a disability. And we're going to train them on learning technologies, different apps, tablet software, and mobile technologies. And this will be a way of providing technology for all students and determining appropriate learning technologies, but also working with students with disabilities on their assistive technologies. And we're seeing a blend between the two now, that people without disabilities are also using technologies and vice versa. So we figured, let's create a learning lab that will meet all students' needs, you know, rather than specializing in just assistive technology. So I'll keep you posted on how that's going. The second year, we're looking at creating lynda.com-like training videos for various roles. And for web developers is the first we're going to tackle. This will allow for certification if a web developer wants to go that route. We're then going to have them, you can also go in and just get knowledge if you want to, rather than getting a full certification. We're going to meet with units one-on-one so that when we're rolling out the web accessibility policy, one of the things we learned at Penn State was it's great for people to go to trainings, but meeting with individual units to find out what their specific issues are, or individual web developers, really helped you know, bring the policy to life and assisted units in making great progress that they might not have gotten with just a training. We're also looking at university-wide trainings and webinars and conferences throughout the year, and looking at the infrastructure of IT departments and where resources can be shared to assist in our efforts. And then the next focus is on our purchasing policies and vendor relations. We're also making some great progress on online courses, so we have buy-in from our Vice President for online courses. We've developed online accessibility practice group that is made up of faculty, instructors, and administrators who are teaching online or working online. We've developed an online course accessibility policy and best practices, as well as ensuring that instructional technologies are compliant. One of the biggest successes we had over the last year is our Vice President hired Cheryl Burkstaller to create a 6-week course for faculty, and we had 40 faculty take the online course on accessibility and compliance in online education. And this was opened up to faculty here at Rutgers, but also faculty within other institutions took the course as well. Extremely successful, and I think it made a huge impact for a lot of our faculty teaching online. So I'm going to stop there. And is there anything from anybody else?
I really appreciate all this really good information, and information we can definitely apply to our own campuses, Bill. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marlene. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
I will share your PowerPoint out with the group if that's okay with you, Bill.
That's great.
Okay. We'll have that up on our website as well as this recording next week. So be sure and check back. And if you have questions for Bill, I'm sure we'd love to stay in touch with you, Bill, and maybe bring you back after more developments happen there at Rutgers.
Sure. Feel free to contact me anytime and send the group my contact information. I'd be happy to do that.
All right, we'll do. Our group will meet again on December 5th, and Elaine Ober from Pearson's is joining us. She's the Associate Director of Accessibility for Pearson Higher Education North America, and she will have a lot to share with us as well, and I'm sure you will have questions for her about the accessibility of their products. So hope you can join us then. Thank you again, Bill, and look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thank you again, everybody. And my contact information is on the screen now if you want to contact me.
Great.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Bill.
Take care.
You too, Bill.
Thanks.